So I'm very happy to introduce our keynote conversation session today, and our two speakers for this session, Jerry Davis and Bart Houlihan. And so the way that this session is going to run is each speaker will have the floor for 20 minutes. I'm going to come on screen and give a little wave when you have about a minute left. And then at the end, we hope that we'll have a few minutes left over for some Q&A. And Chris Marquis will be joining me as a co-moderator for the Q&A. And for those of you who don't know Chris, Chris is the Samuel C. Johnson Professor in Global Sustainable Enterprise and a Professor of Management at Cornell University. He's researched and written extensively about B Corps over the years, including his book release last year, which is a really great classroom resource guide that I can plug as I'm using it in my business ethics class this semester. My students love it, called Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. So Chris will be joining us at the end, and he'll be monitoring the chat. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we have time for. So I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who's Jerry Davis. Dr. Jerry Davis is a professor of business administration and professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. He is modeling the kind of interdisciplinary research approach that we're really trying to spotlight at this roundtable today. So really glad that he's joining us. He's a fellow of the Academy of Management. He served in many leadership roles for boards and organizations that are devoted to scholarship about organizations, corporations, and society. And he has many publications, including 6 books, the latest of which is due out next year. And his publications span across disciplines of management, sociology, and finance. And his research is broadly concerned with the corporation as a social and economic vehicle. So thank you, Jerry, for joining us today. I will now turn the floor to you for our first keynote address.
Oh, thank you so much, Emily. That was very kind. And thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm really excited to be here. I know the work that goes into organizing these meetings. So all props to you for doing this hard work, because it is hard work. And under rewarded, but thank you so much for the work that you've done on this. And I'm really excited to be on a panel with Bart, because the B Corporation movement has been incredibly successful and important and timely. And so it's amazing to be paired with someone who's had such an impact on the world. So I'm really happy to be part of this. As is usual for me, I start with a downer title, which is Are Corporations Inevitably Evil? A research agenda for B academics. If you've ever been around me, you know that my answer is yes. They are pretty much inevitably evil, and I want to sort of substantiate that, but then put some boundaries around it and see ways in which sort of B corporations might be able to address that, and what are the research implications for all of this. So I start with a gnomic question. I just want to say I want the word gnomic to go viral because I think it's pretty dope. The question is, how are corporations like breakfast? And it sounds like a very psychedelic and mystical Zen koan, but we use the word corporation to describe a lot of things that are not alike, like breakfast. If you think about what do kids eat for breakfast, breakfast is not a thing. It's a word with a whole lot of reference to it. In Japan, it might be fish and soup and rice, and Turkey, it might be a bunch of pastries and vegetables, and France, who knows what the hell they're having there. I assume it comes with wine. In Malawi, it's pasho and yams. In Iceland, oatmeal. In Brazil, apparently it's sliced up pieces of animal flesh rolled into pieces. So interesting, like the word breakfast does not refer to a thing. It's incredibly diverse around the world. And we use it as if there should be a breakfast science and that we should be able to examine these things using the same principles, but maybe not so much. And of course, now that Joel has returned to America, the American theory of breakfast is that breakfast should consist of desiccated, extruded corn and sugar pellets that come in a box, and then you pour milk on them. And then if you're outside the US, you learn that your breakfast has institutional voids because it doesn't look like the American version. If your breakfast doesn't look like, you can't publish in the top journals because they only really care about American breakfast cereal. So by analogy, corporations look incredibly different around the world. Take the single most basic feature of a corporation. How big is it? How many people work there? And if you look around the world at these 8 different countries, you discover that there's incredible variety in how big they are, what industries they're in. Like the biggest companies look really different around the world. And just to call out a few things here, the biggest corporation based in Denmark has more employees than the biggest corporations in India and China, which is insane. In social science terms, Denmark is small and China is big. So this should not really be the case. That's a very odd thing. In many countries, the biggest corporations are pretty tiny, even though the country itself might be huge. And the industries are super varied. In the US, they're all in retail. In Germany, it's manufacturing, IT, mostly India, mostly IT services, banking and food, banking and petroleum, banking and construction materials. This is really weird. There's a whole lot of variation around the world in what corporations look like on this most basic of features. Another thing, how big should an auto company be? Let's just take out all the variation, look only at car companies. 3 biggest car companies in 2015 all produced the same number of cars, which was 10 million. And yet they had radically different sizes in employment. In the US, GM exists to create shareholder value, and they had 200,000 employees. Japan, Toyota exists to ennoble Japan on the global stage. They had 350,000. And Volkswagen, in Germany, Volkswagen exists to create good jobs for German workers, and they got 600,000 of them. Same cars, same markets, and yet produced in very different formats. So I just want this as a base case. There's huge global variety, and we have to take this really seriously when we think about things like, can you transfer practices from one place to another? And what are the things that make it possible or not possible to grow a particular kind of corporation? I have a paper with my brilliant doctoral student, Asim Sinha, where we summarize a few of these points. Corporations vary wildly around the world. One way to try to explain that is to examine the sources of the raw materials, the domestic markets for capital, labor, supply, and distribution. Information and communication technologies are changing all of these markets a bunch, but in ways that vary substantially around the world. Same technology gets implemented in really different ways. I think the question for B academics is, what does this mean for the uptake of alternative, purpose-driven forms? Where are they going to thrive and where are they not going to thrive? And how does that depend on the national flavors of institutions? I'm going to make a claim, which is corporations are fundamentally shaped by their national institutional terroir. I want to trademark that phrase as well, institutional terroir. I think it's pretty dope. You can grow cacao in Côte d'Ivoire. You cannot grow it in Canada. No matter how delicious it is, you can't grow cacao in Canada. So what is the equivalent of sort of the soil and the climate for firms? Capital markets, labor markets, supply markets, rule-bound product markets, and then methods to organize these things internally. But all of these things, all of these markets vary greatly around the world, A, and they're being drastically reorganized by information technologies, which is part B. And I'm going to call this institutional climate change, that information technologies are like climate change for the national institutions that enable or constrain the kind of corporations that you get. And I'm going to say something that with this group won't be controversial, but in the outside world or with Colin Mayer, you get it. This does not make me beloved by my colleagues. It's just that profit-oriented corporations are responsible for creating or exacerbating nearly every societal pathology. This is why we have B corporations, is to fix this problem. The opioid epidemic, the obesity epidemic, Juul, they've brought back cigarette smoking for teenagers, for God's sakes. It is insane. Big tech destroying happiness, truth, and democracy, and big oil collapsing our civilization. All of these, so whenever you talk to Ayn Rand reading free market buddies down the hall, they talk about, oh, you have an iPhone, you must love markets. Like, yeah, but I'm fat and I blame Nestle. So, you know, corporations have really they've lowered America's lifespan and they're destroying the climate. So, you know, I don't think we can give them too much credit. So I think the reason behind this in the US is that our terroir is shareholder capitalism, and I'm going to say it's fundamentally pathological. Creating shareholder value really means keeping your share price up and not anything more moral than that. And in the US, we have a whole lot of institutions that force corporations to seek shareholder value no matter what. Analysts, hedge funds, state law, boards, share-based concentration, compensation, the market for corporate control. it is very difficult for corporations not to pursue share price, even if they want to. And Wall Street hates companies that create jobs, that pay well, and engage in CSR. There's actually pretty good research on this. You can't be good and survive Wall Street. That's basically my punchline here. So I would summarize it by saying that shareholder capitalism is kind of like Lake Erie off the coast of Toledo in the summer. That green is not shimmery, beautiful water. That's algal blooms, which makes it impossible to swim in or drink this water. You can drop your purpose in, or porpoise, but it's not actually going to work. It doesn't matter what species of fish you throw in there, they're going to be polluted by their surroundings. I think that's the situation with shareholder capitalism. And I think you can see this with the fate of some of the B corporations that have listed on the market. There just haven't been that many that have gone public. Rally Software lasted for 2 years. Etsy went public and then got defrocked 2 years later by investors. Laureate Education has a sugar daddy that kind of protects them in KKR. And then, Amalgamated Bank, a little bit more hopeful. And then in 2020, there have been a few more interesting cases of companies going public that look like certified B corporations. And so Chris Marquis is trying to convince me the tide has turned. Something has changed. And so maybe we're going to see more of them. Maybe we're no longer in Lake Erie. And then I will throw Danone in his face and say, come on, dude, they're not even American and they still have a hard time resisting this stuff. So kind of the question there is it possible to survive as a public corporation? Is it possible to put on a wetsuit and somehow protect yourself from the nightmare that is shareholder capitalism? So more broadly, if you believe my story about institutional climate change, which I think is a pretty good story, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, although I've been wrong about everything before, but it does feel like capital markets, labor markets, everything is being transformed. What opportunities does that create for B corporations? We're living in a time where the building blocks for organizations are littered around the societal landscape. It only takes a little entrepreneurial energy to assemble them into a structure. Meyer and Rowan wrote that 45 years ago. Now it's literally true. Anybody can create a firm if they've got a credit card and a web connection. So what can this lead to? What are some of the opportunities that this is creating where B scholars might have some interesting things to say? One of them is that universal fab facilities could be collectively or cooperatively or municipally owned. So you could have something like a tech shop or a universal fabrication facility that's like a public library, where you don't need to invest the capital to be able to create an enterprise and gain access to the tools that you need sort of to make your business run. So that makes me optimistic. If we had universal fab facilities, and it could be an opportunity for small scale, not a lot of capital enterprises to sprout and not go public, and they could remain as sort of B corporations optimistically. Designs could be proprietary like Nike, or they could be freeware like Linux. We could have all kinds of free designs for sneakers out there that get created by a 3D printer in your universal fab facility. That's interesting to me. There's examples of this at Fab Furniture in Kentucky. They design furniture and they post their designs on the web with cut files and say, if you got access to a ShopBot router, you can make these. Just go to Home Depot or whatever, or go to Lowe's. Don't go to Home Depot. Go to Lowe's and get some plywood. You can make your own furniture using these cut files, which is awesome. Brew Detroit. It is a brewing co-op in Detroit where a bunch of different brewers have chipped in on the capital equipment, and they do their production runs. Like I get Monday, you get Tuesday, and so it's like Land O'Lakes or other sort of farmer co-ops, where we could share the capital equipment and not be bound by that capital expense, meaning you don't have to go public and you don't end up in Lake Erie. So I think that's optimistic. And then service enterprises could be organized as certified B platform co-ops. Up and Go in New York, which I love, which is a home cleaning business organized as a platform. And now there's a drivers cooperative in New York that's battling against Uber to give cab drivers an opportunity to build some capital and be owners of their own enterprises. Why not B Corps? So maybe there's some fun potential alliances between B Corps and this new movement for cooperativism. And I'm just going to give a shout out to democracy here. And I know I'm out of time, so Let me just point you all to democratizingwork.org. I will post a link to this. They're having a global conference next week on democracy at work, democratize, decommodify, decarbonize the economy. And so I think there's some real potential synergies between B scholars in this movement towards workplace democracy. Yeah, I will quit there and turn it over to Bart.
Thank you, Jerry.
And I'm on time. What the hell?
You actually finished under time, which is super impressive. And I didn't have to be the bad guy coming on the screen and waving my hand. So that's good. I just want to remind everybody, for questions for Jerry or for Bart, please put your questions in the chat. We're monitoring that. Okay, so I will go ahead and introduce our second keynote speaker for today. This is Bart Houlihan, who joins us from B Lab. Along with his partners, Jay Cohen-Gilbert and Andrew Kasoy, of course, Bart co-founded the nonprofit B Lab in 2006 to build a more inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system. And B Lab now has offices in 33 countries and has over 4,000 companies certified through its third-party certification process. That number just keeps going up and up every year. I introduce someone from B Lab. It's great. In addition, B Lab is working to upend shareholder primacy and advance stakeholder governance models through its advocacy for benefit corporation legislation, which now has been passed in 43 US states and 7 countries at the national level. So before co-founding B Lab, Bart was the president of a $250 million basketball footwear and apparel company. So he brings this corporate experience to bear at B Lab, and we're really grateful that he's here today and showing his ongoing support for B academics. So I'll hand the floor over to you now, Bart, and thank you again for being with us.
Of course, Emily. I'm delighted to be back with all of you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Excellent. Give me a thumbs up if you guys can see my screen. All right, let me get back to the beginning of this. Perfect. So first, Jerry, holy crap, I got to follow that. I don't have remotely the number of jokes and anything at all to trademark or define new terms. So I feel a little ill-equipped for this presentation, but I do hope to bring a touch more optimism about our corporate friends and what we see happening right now in the corporate world. What I'd love to do is give you all kind of an update. I've last spoken to you almost exactly 2 years to the day. We were back at our Champions Retreat in 2019. It feels both a minute ago and an eternity ago, if I kind of reflect about where we are in the world right now. And I'd love to both give you guys an idea of what's happened internally at B Lab over the last 24 months, and then talk a little bit about our 2020 and 2021, what's been happening with the global movement. And hopefully it'll bring you all up to speed with all that's been moving forward, because it has been an absolutely insane 24 months since we last spoke. And it really begins with some internal efforts at B Lab to restructure the organization. About 2 years ago, we realized that B Lab, the nonprofit, was really ill-equipped to drive a global movement. What we were looking at was an organization that was US-centric, with sister nonprofits around the globe, and we needed to transition this organization from a US organization to a global organization. And what that meant was restructuring the entire network so that we now have a B Lab Global, and US and Canada became just one more global partner of all of our global partners around the world. It also meant a new board of directors, a new global leadership team. And so it's been a period of pretty intense transition for the network. And one of the efforts that we were focused on over that time frame was really working on trying to define clearly for the network both a vision and a new theory of change. We wanted to try to make really clear for everybody in the network and anybody affiliated with this work what we're trying to accomplish. And it began with reframing our vision statement. And you all have heard this now for a few years about an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system. That vision inspired a deep dive into our theory of change. I figured who better than a group of academics to share a theory of change. I don't usually give this presentation, but I thought there might be some modest appreciation for how we're trying to address these global challenges and what strategies have been born out of this theory of change. And I'll walk through it relatively quickly so you get a sense of it. At the highest level, I hope you've heard from us over the years that we really have three different areas of change we're focused on to try to move the economic system: behavioral change, structural change through a legal framework, and then finally cultural change, changing the narrative about what business is and what it can do for society and the environment. And ultimately, we believe that those three focuses of change can really address these fundamental negative impacts, where we're talking about individual well-being, environmental degradation, and of course, structural inequality that we see globally. Those are the negative impacts that we're focused on with those three areas of change. Now, we have mapped out our stakeholders for the first time as clearly as we can, and we divide them into catalyzing stakeholders and system stakeholders. On the catalyzing side, we have our community of certified B corporations and benefit corporations and those using our standards, and other allies for economic systems change. And then obviously, we move through all of the system stakeholders. Here you all are, just to make sure I don't get called out for the academics not showing up on our stakeholder map. And ultimately, that stakeholder group and those particular negative impacts drive these strategies. It begins with a focus on a community of leaders that manifest the change that we seek to create, that community of certified B corporations. As Emily mentioned, we have about 4,200 certified B corporations now. I think well over 150 industries, over 80 countries. Commonality is they're all using business as a force for good. They range from multi-billion-dollar companies down to sole proprietors. And they are what we call our enabling strategy. They enable us to tell a different story about the role of business in society and to try to change cultural norms about what people expect from the business community. They also inspire people to use our tools to measure, manage, and improve their social and environmental impact. They indeed help advocate for those legal changes that we're seeing across the globe right now, whether it be here in the US with 43 states having adopted some form of benefit corporation, and now I think it's 8 additional countries that have passed the legislation at a federal level. And then finally, they come together to catalyze local communities for action, using the power of a community to do something that we can do together that we can't do alone. These are our strategies that we deploy across that network of global partners that are now on 6 continents. That strategy has had some clear intermediate outcomes. What we're trying to drive is obviously capital markets that seek to actively invest in higher impact, higher purpose companies. We're trying to build a different narrative, a consistent narrative about what economic actors can do to benefit society and the environment and change the notion of shareholder primacy. Fundamentally, we hope that long-term we have different metrics of success for business, that we're not just using financial metrics to define what a good business is, that we look at environmental footprint and community engagement and worker wellness as elements of a successful business. That we start to hold accountable those companies that are creating negative impact for society and the environment. And then finally, decision-making across corporations begins to take into account all stakeholders. Those are our intermediate outcomes, trying to drive to these final outcomes. First, that power is redistributed from shareholders to stakeholders, increasing the diversity of this broader economic system. That individual health and well-being is improved through an economic system and the role of business, that we are focused now on regenerating the environment, not degrading it, and then finally, that we address a more inclusive and equitable society and economy. Those are the long-term outcomes that we're trying to drive. I'll make sure that I share these slides so that you all have, our formal theory of change and what we're looking to drive, because I do think it has absolutely ramifications for research opportunities, right? Like, are we actually delivering on these intermediate outcomes? And can we see any of the needle start to move on these long-term outcomes? That's what's been happening inside of B-Lab. But what I'd love to now transition to is what's happening in the external environment and what's transpired since our last conversation. As I mentioned, it's been insane. And I really want to begin my narrative about what we're seeing outside at the beginning of the pandemic. Because I want to be honest with these friends, I was terrified when the pandemic hit, absolutely terrified. I thought that first, the pipeline would evaporate, people waiting for certification would leave the pipeline to focus on their business, that no new submissions would come in as companies focused understandably on keeping their doors open during a once-in-a-century global health crisis, and that we would suffer attrition rates that we had never seen before. We were planning scenarios of 20, 30, and 40% attrition rates in the community as either companies went out of business or they just chose to conserve their capital to deal with what certainly was going to be economic hardship coming down the line. We did what every good business leader should do. We put a hiring freeze in place, and we cut our budget by about 25%, preparing for the other shoe to drop. By mid-2020, probably August timeframe, it was pretty clear that we had miscalculated, that that shoe never dropped, that instead we were seeing the greatest surge of interest in this movement in the last 15 years. We saw year-over-year increases of registration on our impact assessment of 60%. Since the beginning of the pandemic, call it April of 2020 till now, we've had about 75,000 companies register to use our tools as a do-it-yourself consulting tool to improve their impact. That's 75,000 out of about 165,000. Like, it's a massive increase in interest and use of our tool. That interest drove submission rates in record numbers. As I mentioned, we have about 4,100 certified B corporations. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there have been 4,200 companies that have submitted for certification. We have a pipeline right now of over 2,000 companies waiting for certification. It is an unbelievable spike in submissions. And it also, I'll be really honest with you all, is a high-class problem, right? We were unprepared for that type of growth. And right now we're trying to deal with that backlog. Perhaps the most interesting data point that we looked at as we were coming into 2021 was when 1 in 6 companies in the United States, small, medium businesses, were failing. We had our lowest attrition rate in the last 5 years. It was less than 6%. We were around 5.5% attrition rate. That's astonishing. I mean, that is clear indicator that these companies simply are just more resilient in these incredibly difficult economic times. And with this surge has been a surge in lots of our ancillary work. It's not just people using the tool to measure, manage, and improve, or certified B corporations. We now have legislation in Parliament in the United Kingdom called the Better Business Act, with 750 companies supporting it, asking to move the Companies Act in the UK, where all companies would essentially have to be the equivalent of a benefit corporation. It has real traction to fundamentally shift UK corporate law for all companies, not opt-in. Similarly, there's something called the Interdependence Coalition in the EU driving the same thing. We're in deep conversations here in the US with the Biden administration about creating the White House Initiative on Inclusive Economic Growth. There are 40 signatories on this initiative led by us and one of our partners. The signatories range from Rockefeller to Ford and everybody in between, advocating for a focused effort from the White House on inclusive economic growth. We've also seen a surge in our collective action, culminating with the B Corp Global Climate Summit that happened just a couple of months ago. I don't know if you all were able to attend. There were 5,600 companies that attended the virtual B Corp Global Climate Summit, our first ever Global Climate Summit, numbers that we've never seen before. And then simultaneously, our teams internally have been driving resources out into the marketplace to try to capitalize on this momentum. I hope you all saw the work done by our team on doing a GRI mapping. And so we now have a very clear GRI mapping, so you can all track the BIA to GRI. We have put out anti-racism resources during the civil unrest of last summer that continue to be used. We put out a COVID-19 resource center to try to give direction to not just our B Corps, but anybody trying to use business as a force for good, but what best actions look like in a global health crisis. We have our climate justice playbook that tries to provide clarity for folks on how to engage responsibly with the climate movement. And then finally, in September, we put out our SDG Insights Report. And this was the culmination of the data we've been collecting on the SDG Action Manager, which launched in January of 2020. We've had thousands of companies use that tool, and we put out a really remarkable insights report that I encourage all of you to look at the end of each of our different sections. We also have calls for potential areas for research around each of the different 17 SDGs. I think what is a good place to kind of conclude this conversation is why. Like, why do we see this massive shift in interest for our movement right now amidst an incredible climate crisis coupled with inequality raging? Like, what's going on that's driving all of this? And it's important to note this isn't coming out of nowhere, right? Like, if we all go back to 2019 and remember the Business Roundtable announcement and the World Economic Forum's new Davos Manifesto, both of those were important cultural moments to essentially increase awareness around purpose-driven enterprises. I don't want to go down the rabbit's hole about whether those proclamations resulted in different corporate action. I'd probably look more a little bit like Jerry and talking about what resulted from those proclamations. And I think personally that we are long past the need for incremental proclamations, but it does represent an important cultural moment to have 181 of the largest American CEOs calling to lead businesses, not just for shareholders, but also for stakeholders. I think those efforts, the Davos Manifesto and the Business Roundtable, had been born out of growing cries for change with rising awareness of the climate crisis, coupled with accelerating wealth inequality, right? We're now at a point where 2/3 of the world's population has less than 3% of its assets, right? And then you drop us into 2020. And in 2020, if we all needed a proof point for the need for economic systems change, it was 2020, right? We had a virus affecting populations radically differently, with marginalized populations being ravaged by this virus. Couple that with long overdue calls for racial justice, and you come out of 2020 with global leaders and business leaders not looking to get back to normal, but looking for a new normal, looking for a new way forward. So that's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves with an enormous surge of interest in the movement, opportunities across the certification, to our tools for impact management, to our policy areas, with unprecedented opportunities for change. The question in front of us is, will we capitalize on this opportunity? Because if I was really honest, I do think that this is an inflection point. I really do, that the combination of all those factors has created a moment. And if we fast forward a decade, we'll look back to this moment to decide whether the idea of stakeholder capitalism was a fad and faded, or whether it was the beginning of a new paradigm. I think that's where we sit. I'm so excited to be with you all. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bart. Okay, so we had a question come up in the chat for you from Kevin Christopher, who owns a B Corp. It's an intellectual property law firm here in the great state of Tennessee. And the question I actually also have too, it's been on my mind as I've been teaching the difference between certified B Corps and legal benefit corporations in the classroom, and it continues to be confusing for people. And so we're just, Kevin's question is just, what is B-Lab doing to kind of create some more clarity around the differences maybe with the terminology, or is this anything on your minds? Could you just speak to that?
Sure. And so I'm not sure this will be satisfying for either you, Emily, or for Kevin, that the confusion is a bit intentional. And the reason why is that we wanted to make sure, as we were designing the benefit core legal framework, that if we had called that the sustainable corporation or something else, our anxiety was that it would not actually drive a broader movement where people viewed themselves affiliated with the B Corp movement. And so we wanted benefit corporation legislation and benefit corporations to feel part of something bigger than themselves and part of a broader movement. And so there's been some help, frankly, Emily, with the PBCs, right? When Delaware added public benefit corporations, and we have seen a spate of IPOs. There'll be a few more happening in the next couple of weeks, including Warby and Allbirds will both be going public, and they all are PBCs. That's been a bit helpful, as we've talked about certified B corporations and public benefit corporations. But the honest truth is that that confusion benefits for us the broader narrative about a movement of people using business as a force for good. It drives more awareness and interest in the broader conversations. If somebody's asking that question, Emily, we're thrilled because they're already into the conversation. And so that's the very honest response. We spent 9 months debating what we were going to call the benefit core legislation and decided that we wanted it to accrue to the broader idea of a movement.
Thank you. So I should tell my students it's good if they're confused and asking questions, I guess. So that's good. They're engaged.
Engagement. That's exactly
good.
Right.
Okay, well, great. Chris, did you want to bring a question? I know you had a question. Would you like to bring it to the floor?
Sure. No, I'd love to ask my old sort of friend and dissertation advisor, Jerry, a question. I really enjoy and am interested in your institutional terroir idea.
Trademark.
You have a lot of trademarked sayings, I know. I'm curious, your talk mostly focused on the US, and as Bart mentioned, the B Corp movement now, there's more B Corps outside the US than inside the US. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, about how the institutional terroir idea might sort of apply other places, and how B Corps can really get hold in places like Europe or Latin America, et cetera.
Yeah, what feels like a really great dissertation topic, if anyone's shopping for one, would be to explain the diversity of uptake around the world. And essentially, are there some soils that are really fecund and fertile for the B Corp idea and others where they fall apart, and make sense of that? I mentioned my student, Asim Sinha, who's the next Chris Marquis, and his dissertation is looking at cross-national differences in things like the uptake of stock exchanges, the uptake of Uber. So, we in the US, we think Uber is this unstoppable invasive species. It's like bamboo that you can never get rid of. The basic idea, you got riders, drivers, they've got a GPS-enabled smartphone, and they find each other. How many ways could that possibly get implemented? And it turns out a lot. Germany's version looks really different than the US, and Sweden and Nigeria and Indonesia and India and China. They all have really different flavors of this simple idea of riders and drivers finding each other using a phone. So something that simple could produce that much variety. It's worth thinking, like, what kinds of industries, who gets more and fewer, and what accounts for that? But also, is it particular kinds of industries? So Bart mentioned having fewer failures fewer losses of B Corps in the US during COVID. And I was highlighting asset-light companies being good targets for this, like entrepreneurs that are running a cleaning company or using a sort of a maker space rather than going public. My memory is that an awful lot of B Corps in the US were like financial consulting, IT consulting, management consulting. A whole lot of it was asset-light businesses. For manufacturers, maybe Patagonia, or the one in Western Michigan, I'm spacing out at the moment. Cascade Engineering, yeah. But sort of, it wasn't a whole lot of big manufacturers. It tended to be more like asset light but intellectual capital heavy businesses. It'd be interesting to see if you get really different findings, if in Germany it's family manufacturers or something like that. So that seems very researchable to me.
Cool, great comments for this B Academics crowd. I mean, hopefully people are looking for research papers or dissertation topics. So thank you so much, Jerry.
Okay, great. We have another question for Bart. This comes from Joel. I'm just wondering if you could speak to the factors that you think are driving attrition rates, both in terms of improvements and decrements. So also, the firms that are up for renewal right now would have first certified 3 years ago, right? So just if you could speak to that and how you kind of reconcile that with what you said about the COVID surge.
Yeah, and so because we have an annual certification fee, we can track on an annual basis attrition rates, because people drop out when we ask for fee structures, right? And so that's how we know it's not just the recert, Emily, it's also annual payment, when often companies that are either in financial distress and or have gone out of business aren't paying their certification fees. And so that's when we start to track that attrition rate on an annual basis. And certainly it includes, and we see the largest percentage of attrition does come from recerts, from companies that actually choose not to recert or for that reason. But that being said, we also get a fair number just because they've decided they're not going to pay their certification fee for whatever reason. And in terms of what we track, two different things. We track what we call forced attrition and unforced attrition. Forced attrition is you got acquired and the new owner didn't want to maintain the certification and or you went out of business. That to us is a different type of attrition than somebody just who says, I don't want to continue to be part of this community because I don't see value in it. And so on top of it being a remarkably low attrition rate, the vast majority of our attrition continues to be unforced attrition, right? Folks who have had to leave the community because their new owners didn't either want to continue the certification and or they're no longer in business. I think the unforced attrition rates are around 2%, but I want to double check that. I know that this is a group that cares about numbers, and so we'll make sure of that. But that's what we're watching and why we see that dichotomy.
Great. And I just had one more question. Are there any more questions? We're watching the chat. I think we've brought everything up, but if we missed something, I'm watching it. Chris, do you have anything else you want to ask? I have one question we can end on.
Go ahead, Emily. Why don't we end on that one question?
All right, great. So Bart, I know there's been this recent decentering effort to kind of, B-Lab was founded in the United States by the three of you from the United States, and there's this very, North American, Western kind of foundation to the movement. And I'm just curious, you mentioned in your theory of change, you have the 3 levels: behavior, cultural, norms, and institutions. So as you kind of expand this globally and create this, this inclusive movement, how does B-Lab, what are those conversations like in B-Lab to, I guess, to honor and recognize and appreciate those cultural differences across the world and not impose too much, on other groups of people who aren't coming from the same.
Aren't American, Emily?
Yeah. So what do you have to say to that?
Sure. And so I think you all know the roots here, right? This began as a U.S. effort to try to have a proof point where we could actually then take this idea and bring it outside. We always had global aspirations. It was written into our original business plan for this to be a global movement. Our first efforts outside the United States were with our friends down at Sistema Bay in Latin America. And based upon their success is when we opened B-Lab Europe, B-Lab UK, B-Lab Australia, B-Lab Africa, and now real efforts in Asia. And what I would say is I think there's really 3 important elements around, or 4 important elements about decentering the US in our work. First is structurally, for Emily, for our first 13 years, US and Canada and the global business were together in one entity. We had B-Lab, and B-Lab included the US and Canadian global partner who was trying to drive the movement here, coupled with the certification agency and the group that came up with the standards and delivered the platform. That combination was problematic. It just by proximity created unintended access for our friends in US and Canada. So first was a decoupling and a restructuring where US and Canada has now been spun out and is an independent entity. Secondly is going to be about who runs our partners on the ground in each of those regions. Those regions are run by local entrepreneurs who understand the local context of business as a force for good, as reflected in Jerry and Chris's question. Like what happens in each of our markets looks quite different depending upon the maturity of this broader movement to use business as a force for good. So the strategies to deploy in market, how to get businesses engaged, what the most important movement building efforts should be, all is driven by the individual nonprofits in each of these different regions. And in some, Emily, we go one layer down, right? We have B-Lab Europe, who then has country partners. Because I'll be honest, B-Lab France and B-Lab Germany are quite different in terms of how they're trying to address the market. Same with Sistema Bay. Okay, Sistema Bay has country partners. And so second would be around the structure of our partners and who's driving. Third would be around the standards themselves. Beginning about, I'd say 5 years ago, Dan Asuski and his team started to create regional standards advisory boards that provided information into our Global Standards Advisory Council about the local realities and how to make sure the standards were applicable in each market. Super challenging because you can't have an enormous proliferation of all the different standards. But some things you can do is you can localize examples, you can bring forward clear reference points to people in that market. And then in the important areas where things need to look different, make sure that they are indeed different. Fourth and finally, what we're doing right now is localizing verification. And so for 15 years, we've principally been doing the verification work or the certification out of the United States. About 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we opened an arm of our verification team in Amsterdam. We also have folks in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And just a month ago, we formed our first partnership with an outside assurance provider, an organization called Gnomic that indeed is a certified B corporation to stay values aligned. Gnomic hires mostly individuals with physical disabilities who work from home. We have now trained folks on 6 continents to actually do the verification work in that region to try to manage everything from time zones to an understanding of documentation that might be necessary to verify the assessment. So those have been the 4 efforts. And I'll finish with the final one that you all should be aware of. Some of you probably know this, which is also, Emily, we have to have different leadership. And so where we're at right now is we have announced, Andrew and myself have announced that we're actually going to be transitioning out of day-to-day operations as co-CEOs of BLAP Global. Over the course of the next probably 3 to 6 months, we'll move into an executive role on the board of directors, still full-time focused on the movement, but more about movement building than day-to-day operations. And we defined a global leader to lead a global movement. And on top of that, it's also the right time for a global social justice movement not to be led by 3 white, heterosexual, affluent male Americans. And so for all those reasons, it's also the right time for us to find a new leader. And so we're in the middle of that as we speak. So those would be my highest level things that I think will hopefully continue to drive us towards a more global movement rather than one that is burdened by an American legacy.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Jerry and Bart for this amazing session. It's been so informative. We're just 2 minutes into our next session, so I'll hand it over to the next session, the panel session, and thank you all for being here.